Hey guys, Visceral Serenity here. Welcome to the first installment of Forgotten VST, where I will cover virtual instruments long since abandoned by their developers, and forgotten into the sands of time. In this video, I'm going to be showing an old vocoder by Native Instruments called the Vokator. Vokator was originally released in 2003, and discontinued a few short years later in 2007. Nonetheless, today I will be going over the Vokator and its primary functionality, and showing what it sounded like to use it. So, let's get right into it. So, I have the Vokator opened inside of Reaper right here, and Reaper is special because it has the ability to play 32-bit VSTs out of the box with nothing else needed. So it's able to handle virtual instruments made way back in 2003 like a champ. So I'm going to show off an initial preset here before I go into too much detail. What's going on here is I have raw audio samples that I found. These are public domain recordings of public domain books, just so I could have large amounts of human speech to show off. So on the left I have a male sample,
when the Edorians were forced into the next plane of existence,
and a female sample,
greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own.
So it's just normal speech, and I'm going to use this as the basis for working with the Vokator. So the way my preset works is it's taking in the live input from Reaper, and it's combining it with its synthesizer that's built into Vokator, where it has the two oscillators, a filter, and an envelope, just like you'd expect, as well as various effects I'll get into later. And I'm going to be playing chords on my MIDI keyboard, and that's going to sound like this.
That before the two galaxies
Sorry, let me turn Vokator back on. It's going to sound like this.
Before the two galaxies began to coalesce, there were never more than 3 solar systems present in either, and usually only one. Thus, when the sun of the planet upon which their race originated grew old and cool, the Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture, since they had to work against time in solving the engineering problems associated with moving a planet from an older to a younger sun. Since nothing material.
My intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That, as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same.
So here I have just one of the stock presets set up that sounds like this.
Grew old and cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture.
You may notice that this has fewer components than the preset that I had up earlier. That is controlled in the options section. This has every parameter that can be opened. As you can see, if you open every single one, this gets about as tall as my 1080p screen. Actually, with every component open, it's even bigger. I have to use my larger 1440p monitor to have everything on screen, so you clearly weren't meant to do that. So I'm just going to go back to that preset. Right, so I'm back in that preset now. So the mode that it's set up on is it's taking my live input from Reaper. The alternative is to do file player, which is where you would essentially input a file into it. I'll show that off later, since Vokator was also a standalone application, so that's necessary. Input B is more interesting. You have the choice between another live input, the oscillator synth, which is just a standard synthesizer that's baked into Vokator, and wave synth, which is a granular synthesizer. So this preset uses the oscillator synthesizer, which has 2 oscillators, a filter, and an envelope. And you can kind of play around with these to get the waveform you want and to adjust a few other parameters. So I'll just do that right now for a little bit.
Grew old and cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture, since they had to work against time.
And as I'm using this, what these do should make a little bit more sense.
From an older to a younger son. Since nothing material.
And notice up here in the top right, you'll have a little small explanation as well, although the text doesn't always fit.
Become available. Those records, folios and tapes and playable discs of platinum alloy, resistant indefinitely even to Edor's noxious atmosphere, agree with those of the Arisians upon this point. Immediately before the coalescence began, there was one and only one planetary solar system in the second galaxy, and until the advent of Edor, the second galaxy was entirely devoid of intelligent life. Be that as it may, Arisian records are clear upon the point that before the 2 galaxies began to coalesce, there were never more than 3 solar systems present in either, and usually...
So as you can see, it's very, very easy to customize your sound to how you'd want it to be. One more interesting thing is this has an LFO section not too unlike the one that was later implemented in Massive, although this is a little less obvious how to use. To enable that, you can click the LFO. There's already a whole bunch of them set up on this preset. And you can enable it by clicking on this. I checked beforehand, all of these pretty much are set up on LFO1. And then it'll do this to essentially add movement to it. Like how I was shifting it manually, that can be done just natively inside the plugin.
Only one planetary solar system in the second galaxy. And until the advent of Edor, the second galaxy was entirely devoid.
So here's how you set that up. It's going to be easier if I clear all of these, which you can do by right-clicking and clear all. So the way that this works is you click on this icon that's like the arrow pointing towards the circle, and that essentially lets you write how much you want the LFO to affect a certain parameter. So in this case, I'm going to pull this up all the way. And now the LFO will have the maximum effect on the waveform slider in oscillator 1. Right-click, exit assignment mode. Now if I right-click again, I'll notice here LFO 1 is equal to 100%.
Of intelligent life. Be that as it may, Arisian records are clear upon the point that before the 2 galaxies began to coalesce, there were never more than 3 solar systems.
So we can see that that clearly works very well. Let's say that that was a little too much. I can click on the assignment mode again and turn that down a little bit. Right-click, exit assignment mode. Right-click again, we'll notice it's 25% this time and not 100, so the effect is not going to be as strong.
Since nothing material was destroyed when the Edorians were forced into the next plane of existence, their historical...
And you can do that for everything in the synthesizer section, as well as a bunch of the stuff around here. And that can add a lot of variation to the sounds instead of having just one static sound all the time. And that's used in a lot of the stock presets, and is very, very useful when making your own as well. Okay, so now we're going to be covering the main panel, which is this thing in the top right corner, one of the most important sections of all of Vokator. This basically decides how Vokator goes about its vocoding. So before I go into any more detail, I'm just going to give a quick basic explanation of what a vocoder is doing. So in a vocoder, you have 2 main components. There's something called a modulator and a carrier. The modulator is generally your mic audio, and the carrier is generally a synthesizer. The frequency output by the modulator, your mic audio, is split evenly into frequency bands, kind of like a graphic EQ. A lot of vocoders use 12 bands or 24 bands. Ableton's vocoder splits into 40. Vocodex and FL Studio, as well as Melda's M vocoder, split into 100. But one of the selling points of Vokator is that splits into 1024 frequency bands. I'm not sure if that really makes that big of a difference, but that was one of the key selling points of Vokator back in the day. And to this day, I'm still not sure if there's another vocoder that does that. I was trying to Google around, and I can't find one that specifically states having as many. So it's very well possible that Vokator is still the only one that does this. So regarding the carrier, usually the synth, its frequency is also split up into an equal 1024 bands here. So the modulator, your voice, will have these things called control signals, which alter the volume of the equivalent bands in the carrier. That results in basically a synthesizer version or recreation of the original inputted audio. Now, full disclosure, I only have a fairly basic understanding of vocoding. I might not be giving the best explanation of how it technically works, so I'm going to be having a few resources in the description that explain it in more detail than what I did, and that have like some graphics to go with it. Alright, so now we're going to go into detail on what each of these buttons actually do. So to my understanding, A times B and B times A basically decide which one of these inputs is the modulator and which one is the carrier. B times A is actually the one that's going to be the most familiar to other vocoders you've used, that has the sound that's a more traditional vocoding sound.
Cool. The Arisians were...
A times B flips that. And the effect given is that it sounds more or less like the audio file, just with extra stuff on it. Like, that's kind of what it sounds like in this situation.
Cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture.
Mix is interesting. So you have 4 knobs. There's a knob just for input A.
The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture.
There's a knob just for input B. Be careful, this gets very loud. So it basically just plays the synthesizer thing that we created. Then there's a knob for A times B.
Also become available.
And a knob for B times A.
And tapes and playable discs of platinum alloy.
So you can use all 4 at once to kind of combine the sound you want.
Noxious atmosphere. Agree with those of the Arisians upon this point. Immediately before the coalescence began, there was one and only one planetary solar system in the second galaxy, and until the advent of Edor, the second galaxy was entirely devoid of intelligent life.
So you can kind of combine like some really interesting sounds that way.
Are clear apart.
Alright, so now group. What that does is that it groups up your 1024 bands into fewer bands. So if we click on these here, out and group, we can kind of see what's going on here. So instead of having just our main 1024 bands, it groups them up into 32 sections, which we can control right here. So now there's 20. In this case, there's 4. So I'll demonstrate what that kind of sounds like.
The Arisians were hard put to it.
And you have some parameters here to adjust how it's working.
We are the sun, since nothing material was destroyed when the Edorians have also become available. Playable discs and playable noxious atmosphere. Agree with those of the Arisians upon this point. Immediately before the coalescence began, there was...
And I think the idea here was to be able to get more of a classic vocoder sound, because the whole 1024 bands does give a bit of a different effect. So if you wanted to use this as a vocoder that sounds like the ones that only go up to 32, you have the option to do that. So that's actually really neat. You can get some really fantastic sounds when using group in combination with these. So next there's sync, which just gets the tempo from the host, which is pretty standard. And then live is a low latency mode that uses more CPU. Obviously that's not a problem for processors in 2020 because this was made in 2003. But the documentation says that low latency mode does reduce the sound quality. So unless you're having specific latency issues, which again in 2020 I doubt, you can pretty safely leave this one unchecked. So now I'm going to cover the output panel and the compressor, which show up when you click that. So the output panel kind of acts like an EQ on the final frequencies after all of the vocoding is done. So like on the special third sound that is created.
And cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture, since they had to work against time in solving the engineering problems associated with moving a planet from an older to a younger sun.
That seems pretty self-explanatory just after using it. The compressor right next to it controls a few things. Trim lets you increase the output gain, since that can be lowered after using the EQ thing to add more character. Threshold controls when the compressor kicks in, so if you set it to 0, the compressor never kicks in because 0 is the loudest it'll get.
And cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture, since they had to work against time.
But then the compressor works better when you set the threshold higher. The ratio is how heavily it applies compression to what it's applying it to. And the shape gives emphasis to either lower or higher.
Available. Those records, folios and tapes and playable discs of platinum alloy, resistant
in terms of how it treats the compression. So that's kind of how that whole section works. So next up we have these sections underneath input A and B, dynamics, delay, and effects. So dynamics is really just a gate which controls the volume at which a sound needs to be to show up at all, essentially. And the more knob kind of acts like a volume gain knob, but with some normalization.
Material was destroyed when the Edorians were forced distance. Their historical records have also those records, folios and tapes and playable discs of platinum alloy.
Delay is just your standard delay if you want some kind of an echo effect.
One planetary solar system, second galaxy,
and then the effects section is where things get really cool. Is you have like a bunch of effects you can pick from that are all a bit different. Which is Jello mold, for instance.
The two galaxies began to coalesce. There were never more than 3 solar systems present in either, and usually only...
That's my favorite one, but there's many others.
...planet upon which their race originated grew old and cool. The Arisians were hard put to it to preserve their culture, since they had to work against time with all the engineering problems associated with moving a planet from an older to a younger sun. Since nothing material was destroyed when the Edorians were forced into the next plane of existence.
And the panel down here is exactly the same, so you have all the same effects to apply to input B.
And tapes and playable discs of platinum alloy, resistant indefinitely even to Edor's noxious atmosphere, agree with those of the Arisians upon this point. Immediately before the coalescence began, there was one and only one planetary solar system in the second galaxy, and until Edor, the second galaxy.
So you can kind of make some interesting effects by playing around with all that. Right, so now I'm going to discuss this section here, Morphing and Synth, which is a part of input B, the synthesizer. So what this does is it basically lets you store 5 different states of how the oscillators, the filter, the envelope, and all the other aspects of all this are. And it morphs between them.
To and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over man.
So let's say that I want to change what 2 is like. So I just click on 2. I can change stuff up.
The worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days.
I'm happy with that, so I'm going to click Store, and then I'm going to click on the number that I'm on, and it locks it in place. Now I can go back and forth between the two.
19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own.
I'm going to do that with 3 as well.
Their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs.
Store, click the number.
Empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger.
So let's say that I want to save this. All I do is I give it a cool name. Then I click Store. And custom name 1 is right there. And I can even change the preset to something else, such as this one again.
That this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than his, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize.
And I can use the morph too to keep all of those settings, but on top of all the rest of the stuff that this preset involved. And then real quickly too, I'm going to cover the Arpegiator that's right here next to Synth and Morph. This basically just takes your chord, but then plays it note by note, depending how you tell it to do, like up and down. Pretty standard Arpegiator.
And upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves. No one
And you can also adjust the velocity.
years of the 19th century. This world was being watched keenly and closely. Intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various.
So that's how that works. So next I'm going to be covering this whole section here with the keyboard and the things next to it. Up until this point, I've been playing Vokator with an actual physical MIDI keyboard, but you don't actually need to. In manual mode, if you're in the center here, you're safe to play the keyboard normally.
No one would have believed in the last years of the
But if you click onto one of these numbers, you can assign notes to them, and they'll stick.
No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
And then you can play them that way. If you go to sequencer mode, that sets up a step sequencer that can sync to your host's beats per minute. And then these bars will kind of control like what number over here that it's going to go to. So let's play that with the metronome on.
No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope.
And finally, if you go into MIDI mode, that's kind of the play a chord with one note mode. So imagine that this is your keyboard layout, right? So like If I'm playing D, then it's going to be 3, and so forth. Then you can do this.
No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That, as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a...
So yeah, that's pretty cool, isn't it? So earlier I showed you the LFOs as a way to modulate the parameters of the oscillators and the other things regarding the built-in synthesizer. But you have more options than just the LFOs. You also have a step sequencer, an envelope follower, and a voiced-unvoiced detector unit. So I'm going to go through those things, starting with the step sequencer. For each step on the step sequencer, you can set a value, and it'll apply that value to the parameter. So I'm going to assign this just to the waveform.
The 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That, as men busied themselves about their...
And you have 2 of those to work with, so I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Next is the envelope follower. And that interacts when there is volume. So in this case, when she's talking, it reacts the louder she gets, but then it won't do anything at all when she's silent. So I'll map that to a few things here.
Under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, to...
So that's what that does, and in this case, you have one that always targets input A and one that always targets input B. And finally, you have the voiced-unvoiced detector unit, which is a little bit similar to the envelope follower, except it only pays attention to unvoiced sounds like S or S. So like sounds like that are loud and that Vokator can't pitch. So I'll clear these away. And right now, I have this set up on the cutoff. So it'll cut away at the cutoff when it detects S's. I'm going to show what that sounds like.
Possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger.
So the more to the left that you turn the threshold knob, the stronger it's going to react when it detects a harsh S sound. And the smooth is the transition kind of between 0 and 100 of what it's going to be doing to it. So if you do smooth all the way to the right,
no one would have believed.
It's kind of more jerky and instant, whereas to the left, it's smoother with more of a transition. And to help demonstrate what this all does, I actually recorded a sample of myself that purposefully has loads and loads of S's in it, so I'm going to play that for just a bit to demonstrate. Testing, testing, testing. Testing, testing, testing. Testing, testing, testing. Yep, and in my case, I'm using it to adjust the cutoff to kind of clear out the S's, but you can apply that as a parameter to anything, and you can get real creative with that. Also, I almost forgot to talk about the LFO strip and the chorus right here, so I'm going to go over those things as well before I continue on. This is different from the LFO things here. Whereas these are meant for modulation, these directly affect the sound. So right now I'm in mix mode and everything except B is disabled, so we're just working with the synthesizer right now. So if I move the pitch down, you'll see the LFO will give it like a wobbly sound. And when it's centered on 0, it's disabled. And this does the same thing, except it only affects the symmetry thing up here. Once again, center it to disable, which can be a little tricky. There we go, and you can tell in the top corner if it's really centered or not. And then harmonics affects the harmonics of oscillator 1 in that way. And center to disable. So, and then I'm going to move on to the one on this side, which is the same as the one for oscillator 1, except these affect oscillator 2. I'm making oscillator 1 quieter in the mix just to test with this. And then this should be the symmetry for oscillator 2. There we go. And then instead of harmonics, there's one for the FM. We're going to bring oscillator 1 back in. So now for the one in the middle. This affects the rate at which the LFO goes. This affects its shape. And this is what affects it if it's going to decay away over time or not. So with this, it'll start with the LFO, and then eventually the LFO will go away. I'm going to make that go faster. And then the LFO is gone. And it works the other way where you can have the LFO fade in. So that's kind of what those all do. Now let's test what this sounds like in the B times A that we're used to using.
Closely, my intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro.
So you can definitely make some interesting things with this, and of course you can use the other LFOs and the other automation tools to do the same thing to these as you did with all the parameters up here. And then finally we have the chorus effect, which is right next to the LFO. So if the mix is all the way to the left, that means it's dry and not being applied at all. And all the way to the right, it's completely wet and you're only getting the chorus part. You probably want somewhere in the middle to have some of each. And you have your usual delay, depth, and rate. As well as a handy feedback knob. Alright, let's see what that sounds like in our usual B times A mode.
Closely, my intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars.
So yeah, that's a pretty cool effect. So the last really big thing to look at is the wave synthesizer. If you go into input B, you change it from synthesizer to wave synthesizer. This sets up a granular synthesizer. And what that is it takes in an audio sample or a wave file, it splits it up into a bunch of pieces, and then it does a bunch of crazy stuff to it. And this is going to be our carrier now instead of the normal synthesizer thing that we created earlier. So I'm going to give a preview of what that sounds like.
My intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
So now I'm going to turn down the B times A. I'm just going to turn up the B so that we just have the sample. So now I'm going to go over all of these controls. So we have the pitch. We have the sample start position. We have the speed, how fast it's going to go. And you can make it go really slow. And you can also make it go backwards. So, and then this sets the position of the loop as well as the length. These set what direction it goes when it hits the end. And it's actually reversed if you do this. And this makes it bounce back and forth. And you can turn the loop off altogether by doing that. This button disables the sample start position and always starts at the beginning of the loop. And as for this option, what it's supposed to do is when you reach the end of the loop, it decides if it can continue past or not, depending on the release of the decay. So like when you're in release mode, should it continue past the loop or trigger the loop? Under normal circumstances, I can't actually get this to work. The only way I can get this to work is if I use my sustain pedal and then take off the sustain pedal before it hits the end. So I hit down the note, and then my foot on the sustain pedal, then I lift off the note and then lift off the sustain pedal, and then this works. So I just did what I described. But if I just normally hit the note, it doesn't do that. So I think this might be, unfortunately, a bug. But yeah, that's how I got this to work, and that confused me for quite a long time. So with all of these things known, next it's time to move on to the LFO section, which is different now. If you skip back in the video, the LFO section was a little bit different back when we were in the oscillator synthesizer. It's different in the wave synthesizer. So let's get into all of those controls. Alright, so this works the same way as before, where it adjusts the pitch. On this sound it might be harder to tell, but that is what it's doing. And this is the rate, the shape, and the decay exactly the same way as before. And then these three parameters line up with the speed, the start, and the length from right here. And you can kind of see how that's messing with the speed as per how these are set. You can also mess with the other parameters in the same way. And as you can see, you can get extremely creative with this. So, with all that said, let's have some fun with this. I have it back into B times A mode right here, and I'm gonna start playing.
And closely, my intelligence is greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No
I'm going to mix in just a little bit of normal B.
Worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars.
So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to swap out the sample with another one. You can do that by pressing the load button. And you have access to all sorts of samples that come with it, but you can also add in your own because they're just WAV files. So just for the heck of it, I'm going to test with this drum file.
Serene in their assurance of their empire over matter.
Let's try a whole drum loop, maybe.
Possible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied that there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves. No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences.
Let's try this one out.
Some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied that there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves. No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater.
I'm going to load in one more sample just to play with. Let's see. How about some keyboards?
Assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied that there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves. No one would have believed, in the last years of the 19th century, that this world was being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. That, as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
So yeah, you can get extremely creative with this, just messing with the settings and seeing what's going to happen. So, that's it. This video probably turned out pretty long, so thanks for sticking with it the whole way through. Let me know what you thought of it and what you might like to see next time. I'm planning on making many more of these type of videos, covering long since discontinued plugins and effects from the yesterdecades. If you enjoyed this first installation of Forgotten VST, please do give a like below and consider subscribing and clicking that bell thing to find out when I upload my next video. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.
Hello.